In an earlier episode, we explored the discontent that had been building up in Czechoslovak society before 1968 and how Alexander Dubček's Socialism with a Human Face had sought to provide a solution. We also explored Soviet reactions, including the Bratislava Declaration, which outlined that the Warsaw Pact could use military force in Czechoslovakia if Dubček's radical reform program continued, but only as a last resort. We ended the first part of this two-part series by suggesting that the Soviet invasion was still not inevitable. I'm your host David, and today we are going to look at why Warsaw Pact forces ultimately invaded Czechoslovakia only weeks later, and if there were any possibilities for reforms to continue even under Soviet occupation, as well as the post-invasion reaction to the crushing of Prague Spring. This is the Cold War. First, a brief recap of the situation on the ground ahead of the invasion in August 1968. Czechoslovak leader Alexander Dubček was facing huge pressure from Leonid Brezhnev to halt the Action Program, better known as Socialism with a Human Face. Dubček's Action Program and the ongoing Prague Spring, which had seen censorship lifted, allowed political pluralism, and ceded significant centralized control of the economy, was considered by Brezhnev as an existential threat to the communist governance model, not just in the USSR, but the entire Eastern Bloc. Nevertheless, Dubček had good reason to believe that Czechoslovakia's sovereignty was safe. Brezhnev had previously expressed support for Dubček, saying that an invasion would only be a last resort, and since the Soviets did not have any troops in Czechoslovakia at this point, it was an emboldened Dubček who stayed the course he had set. However, Dubček was ultimately mistaken in his decision to take Brezhnev's words at face value. Around 11 p.m. on August 20th, the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia began. Under the codename Operation Danube, the first step of the operation took place at Ruzhnya International Airport. 100 plainclothes Spetsnaz agents on a flight from Moscow requested an apparent emergency landing by pretending that there had been an engine failure. They quickly seized the airport upon their arrival. Shortly after, a force consisting of 250,000 troops provided by the USSR, Poland, Bulgaria, and Hungary advanced towards Prague, accompanied by over 2,000 tanks. They met little resistance on their way to the Czechoslovak capital, quickly taking over the city. With rather obvious echoes of more recent history, the operation's intention was to depose Dubček and establish a puppet government more conducive to Moscow's aims. As we just mentioned, Dubček was convinced that Czechoslovakia's sovereignty was safe and that an invasion would not happen. As a result, few preparations, if any at all, had been made for any such eventuality. The Czechoslovak leadership's initial reaction was thus to simply make it clear to the international community that the invasion was both illegitimate and unwanted. This is exactly what they did on the eve of the invasion at a secretly organized 14th KSC Party Congress in Vysočany as Warsaw Pact troops occupied strategic locations across Czechoslovakia. Dubček and the other Prague Spring leaders also called on their citizens to fight back, a call which was met with approximately 7 days of open opposition from ordinary citizens. As a direct consequence of this public opposition, 137 Czechoslovaks died and a further 500 individuals were seriously wounded in the violence. Though this response highlights that the Prague Spring leaders were blindsided by the decision to invade, it also begs the obvious question of why Brezhnev made the sudden decision to do so, in spite of his repeated assurances to the Czechoslovaks that it would be a last resort. Indeed, though Czech historian Oldřich Tuma notes that the invasion was well planned in advance militarily, the political decision took much longer. In the days after the invasion, Brezhnev gave his justification to Dubček, quote, "Your borders are our borders as well. Because you do not listen to us, we feel threatened. In the name of the dead in World War II who laid down their lives for your freedom, we are therefore fully justified in sending our soldiers into your country so that we may feel truly secure within our common borders." But this still only tells us why Brezhnev made the decision rather than why it took so long. Another Czech historian, Daniel Povolny, essentially boils down the delay to two factors. First, the Soviet Politburo was itself divided over how to resolve the issue until well into August 1968. And second, there were still a number of hardliners in the KSC who could have potentially limited the scale of Dubček's reforms before August. When it became clear that Dubček wanted to remove these hardliners from the party, however, Brezhnev decided that the potential for a diplomatic solution had disappeared. Vivaldi's analysis thus provides perhaps the most feasible explanation for the delay. Returning to the Czechoslovaks' response to the invasion, the brief but brave civil unrest in response to the reformers' pleas proved highly consequential. For one, it widely discredited the invasion in the eyes of the international community and even within the Eastern Bloc and other communist countries. The response was conspicuously negative. Yugoslavia, Albania, and Romania had all rejected the Soviets' hegemony in the years preceding 1968, and they therefore roundly condemned the Warsaw Pact's invasion. The East Germans, who had originally agreed to provide a significant force of troops to assist the invasion, also changed their commitments at the 11th hour and ended up only providing just a handful of specialists, something about the optics of a German invasion of Czechoslovakia, after all. Particularly harsh criticism came from the People's Republic of China. Chinese radio called it a monstrous crime, for example, while Mao Zedong's premier Zhou Enlai criticized its, quote, savage fascist nature. Though this is perhaps unsurprising given the Sino-Soviet split in the early 1960s, the sentiments of the Chinese Communist Party leadership were widely shared. In spite of this widespread international condemnation and resistance from ordinary Czechoslovaks, however, the Soviets made quick work of their intention to get rid of Dubček and the reformers. Almost as quickly as the Warsaw Pact troops had arrived in Prague, the Prague Spring leaders were kidnapped in secret and taken to the Kremlin in Moscow for interrogation by the KGB. At this point, it seemed that Dubček's time was up. Had the Prague Spring and its reforms really been crushed with such ease? Well, not quite. Strangely, Dubček was only kept in Moscow for a matter of days before being reinstated as the head of the KSC and allowed to return to Prague. There were, broadly speaking, two reasons for this perhaps unexpected outcome. For the historian Harold Skilling, one of the key reasons was once again the resistance to the invasion displayed by ordinary Czechoslovaks. It was clear that Dubček's leadership was popular and therefore legitimate, reaffirming the strong condemnation of the invasion by communist and capitalist states alike. The second was that Dubček's supporters had completely taken over the KSC in the build-up to the invasion, despite the fact that one of Brezhnev's intentions was to avoid this very development. This left the Soviets with few viable leadership alternatives, let alone enough figures to build an entire government. So the Soviets had to bide their time before Dubček could be removed. Still, the reality was that the Soviet Union was a military superpower, especially compared to Czechoslovakia. If it really wanted to, it could have overcome these problems with relative ease. The decision to reinstate Dubček was thus not merely an act of goodwill, nor one of pragmatism by the Soviet leadership. Instead, on August 26, 1968, Dubček was forced to sign the Moscow Protocol. Many historians consider the Moscow Protocol as a diktat, or dictated peace, in which Dubček had to agree to a list of Soviet demands to enable the Prague Spring leaders to remain in power. The Moscow Protocol, in short, saw Dubček accept the legitimacy of the Soviet occupation and agree to end political pluralism by banning groups like the Club of Committed Non-Party Members, CAN, and K231, a group of former political prisoners. The Moscow Protocol also forced the dismissal of numerous reformers from the party and enforced a refrain from purging any remaining hardliners. It also retracted the Czechoslovak government's request to the United Nations Security Council to address the situation. Perhaps the most important clause in the Moscow Protocol was that it did not offer a timeline for the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Czechoslovakia. Instead, it merely specified that their withdrawal would occur in stages. In effect, then, the Moscow Protocol forced Dubček to accept the indefinite subjugation of Czechoslovakia to the USSR's whim. As you may have figured out by now, many events of the Prague Spring continue to be the subject of great controversy. Dubček's signature of the Moscow Protocol is no exception. Indeed, it immediately prompted fierce debate among Czechoslovak society and historians alike, the reformers held on to power, but at what cost? Though many Czechoslovaks considered Dubček's signature of the Moscow Protocol a staunch betrayal at the time, historians such as Miloš Barta have since offered a more balanced view. In 1993, Barta wrote, "We sometimes read that Dubček and his colleagues signed a verdict on themselves and the movement they represented. Notwithstanding the significant role which diplomacy plays in history, major historical conflicts are generally not settled at a conference table, but by force, often military force. This was also the case of the Prague Spring." The reality was thus that the Czechoslovaks simply could not defend themselves against the sheer military might of the Eastern Bloc majority and the USSR, so had no real choice but to yield to Brezhnev's demands. Dubček nevertheless aimed to resist the most humiliating terms of the Moscow Protocol, and in the months after its signing, there was a lingering sense among the KSC that some reforms could continue. And to some extent, the KSC was proved correct. On January 1st, 1969, Czechoslovakia was turned into a federal state, which in practice devolved significant power to Slovakia. Economic reforms, although, continued to be debated openly throughout late 1968. However, these sentiments did not align with political realities, and there was a simultaneous and almost palpable shift in Dubček's rhetoric and policy-making approach. In the weeks after the invasion, Dubček described the political organizations KAN and K231 as frankly anti-socialist, for example, and the Social Democratic Party was also banned. In short, one of the core tenets of the Prague Spring, political freedom and freedom of expression, was reversed as a consequence of the invasion, just as Brezhnev had desired. Dubček's gradual dismantling of the Prague Spring reforms during this time was part of a broader concept of so-called normalization that underpinned the terms of the Moscow Protocol. As the word itself implies, normalization essentially necessitated a return to the normality of communist rule before the Prague Spring started by re-establishing the hegemony of the KSC in domestic politics and re-centralizing key sectors of the economy. While Dubček was using his time being forced to normalize Czechoslovak politics, the Soviets were using their time to look within the ranks of the KSC for a more conservative successor. The man who would eventually replace Dubček was Gustav Husak. Husak had been an ally of Dubček prior to the events of August 1968 and led the reform process in Slovakia as the nation's vice premier. After the invasion, however, Husak changed his tune and sought to establish himself as a pragmatic alternative to Dubček's ultimately naive idealism. At the 14th Extraordinary Congress of the Slovak Communist Party on August 28, 1968, Husak made his position on the occupation clear. "We've been criticized that now and again we have not been capable of maintaining control of events. We said we are preparing the Congress, we will form new organs, and we will create the political prerequisites for a struggle against the real anti-socialist forces. Unfortunately, on these matters, we reached no understanding." In reference to what he saw as two paths to end the occupation, to either accept the Soviets' normalization process or push on with the desired reforms, Husak continued, "There is no third alternative. If anyone has a better proposal, or if anyone can think of another concept, let them come forward. All party members, even the entire leadership, have been racking their brains. So that is how the question stands, either to back Dubček and the others resolutely, or to express in them a vote of no confidence." In effect, what Husak was saying was that the only way for Czechoslovakia to feasibly regain its sovereignty was to accept the normalization process. Dubček and the reformers, he felt, were not willing to accept this reality wholesale and would make the situation worse if they did not do so. As time passed, Husak was proved correct. Despite the post-invasion reforms we mentioned earlier, they were clearly watered down and did not really align with the initial aims of the Prague Spring. The Czechoslovak public and the KSC accordingly became increasingly disgruntled with Dubček's non-committal stance, the state of limbo in which they found their country, and a crumbling economy. In mid-September 1968, for instance, a letter from a group of working people demanded to know why key leaders like Dubček, Josef Smirkovsky, Oldrich Černek, and Sedimir Cisar had not had the decency to follow figures like Joseph Pavel or František Kirgel in their decision to resign immediately after the invasion. Moreover, by October 1968, just 2 months after the invasion, an internal survey of the KSC membership showed that 65% thought accepting Moscow's demands was the, quote, only possible solution. 1 month later in November, Dubček, Husak, and other KSC leaders traveled to Moscow in secret in an attempt to negotiate a framework within which they could simultaneously end the occupation and continue with some reforms. The outcome of these talks was the November plenum. Upon his return to Prague, Dubček outlined the plenum's terms in a speech which urged calm and compliance with the Soviets. In a word, normalization. Historian Kieran Williams outlines that Czechoslovak society subsequently stopped short of making a real challenge, knowing that to do so would only invite disaster. They now limited themselves to reactive moments while deliberating whether the retreats of normalization demanded greater radicalism or realism. In sum, after the November plenum, the Prague Springs leaders lost faith in the potential for true reform, and with that, so did the public. Dubček remained at the helm of the KSC, but the writing was on the wall. The eventual outcome of the discontents of late 1968 was Husak's appointment as leader of the party in April 1969, and with that, the final demise of Dubček. Given that many Czechoslovaks considered that Dubček's leadership was no longer compatible with political realities, Husak's appearance as a competent figurehead who could guide the stricken country through the crisis resulted in his appointment being broadly welcomed. In time, though, it would become clear that Husak had probably had his own leadership ambitions all along and merely saw collaboration with the Soviets as a means to this end. Indeed, the Soviet leadership only gave vague instructions on how to achieve normalization. One instruction mentioned the need to, quote, put the party apparatus in order, for example, and they simply told Husak to heed lessons from the Lenin and Stalin years to achieve this. The eventual outcome was a highly systematic purge, which saw 56% of reform-minded party members ousted from district committees, and 62% were purged from their various positions more than once. But the purge did not need to be so harsh. It was Husak's choice. Even more humiliating for the Czechoslovaks, in early May 1970, Husak's government officially signed a new friendship treaty with the Soviet Union. This resulted in a stark decline in party membership as workers quit in disgust. Regarding Husak's early years in power, Kieran Williams notes that, quote, even a cursory glance at patterns of compliance, strategies selected by the reform's coalition members, and Soviet interference suggests that the responsibility for the death of liberalization is borne to varying degrees both by those who actively ended it and those who passively or unwittingly allowed it to be killed. The Soviets' ostensible success in pacifying the Czechoslovak reform movement also had far-reaching consequences beyond the borders of Czechoslovakia. In the Eastern Bloc, leaders in countries who were particularly reliant on Soviet support, namely East Germany and Poland, towed the party line even more carefully than they had before. Moreover, the West realized that any efforts to improve diplomatic relations with Eastern Bloc states was going to be largely wasteful, and that it would be better to negotiate with Moscow directly. With Soviet hegemony over the Eastern Bloc re-established by the early 1970s, Husak continued to preside over a regime characterized by normalization and acquiescence for 2 more decades, until the ultimate collapse of Czechoslovak communism in 1989. During this time, conditions did arguably become materially better for ordinary Czechoslovaks. Living standards rose along with access to consumer goods, and perhaps most importantly of all, life became predictable and stable. But in truth, the forces that had caused Czechoslovakia's flirtations with democracy in 1968 never really disappeared. The most infamous example of this was the informal civic manifesto known as Charter 77, first published as a form of samizdat on January 6, 1977. With its rhetoric clearly rooted in the initial aims of the Prague Spring, it staunchly criticized Husak's KSC for failing to implement the humanitarian obligations of several documents it had signed, including the 1975 Helsinki Accords and the UN's 1966 Covenants on Political, Civil, Economic, and Cultural Rights of Individual Citizens. Among Charter 77's main architects was Václav Havel, the man who would later go on to become the liberalizing president of Czechoslovakia following the 1989 Velvet Revolution. Though state media described Charter 77 as anti-state, anti-socialist, and demagogic, and the government quickly implemented a ban on its publication, the centralized campaign against it was so vicious that nearly all Czechoslovaks knew about it even if they had not read it themselves. By the late 1980s, as socialist regimes across the Eastern Bloc were becoming weaker and weaker, Havel and the other figures who had signed Charter 77 became increasingly organized in raising societal awareness about the humanitarian crimes of the Husak government. Nearly all of its signatories would therefore go on to play key roles in Czechoslovak politics following the collapse of Husak's regime. It's important to also point out that the crushing of the Prague Spring had an impact inside the Soviet Union as well. The Soviet propaganda machine had certainly swung into action as soon as the 21st of August, guiding and formulating the narrative of Soviet fraternal aid to protect socialism. It was a common refrain that the Soviet army was needed to stop the threat of Western subversion. But not everyone saw the events of August 1968 through rose-colored glasses. The KGB, especially in places like Ukraine and Lithuania, accumulated hundreds of reports of anti-Soviet statements, likening Soviet actions to Tsarist imperialism, fascism, and even American actions in Vietnam. A small group even went so far as to stage a public protest on Red Square, unveiling signs that read, "Hands off the Czech SSR," and "For your freedom and ours." For the record, they were arrested and taken away within minutes. These protesters were handed out sentences of exile to the Far East or committed to mental health institutes. For many inside the Soviet Union, Prague Spring was a transformative moment. In the words of Boris Kagarlinsky, on the morning of 21st of August 1968, the entire ideology of Soviet liberalism collapsed in a few minutes, and all the hopes aroused by the 20th Congress fell to the ground. The Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 did achieve its short-term ambition to crush the Prague Spring, topple Dubček, and safeguard Soviet hegemony over the Eastern Bloc. But its long-term effects were far greater than the Soviets could have anticipated. Indeed, the Prague Spring ultimately sowed a seed of liberalization that could not be destroyed even by the might of the Soviet military, a seed that would later blossom into a much more existential threat to communism in Europe. Czechoslovak society's consistent resistance to Husak's normalization also proved pivotal, and rightly continues to be celebrated to this day. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button before a rival bell button declares an emergency, lands, and allows 200 Spetsnaz troops to take out our bell button. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.